When an elite physics professor mocks a woman for stepping into his classroom, he challenges her to solve a problem meant to embarrass her. But what he doesn't know is, she's been hiding a mind sharper than his. The lecture hall buzzed with the low hum of idle conversation, its polished floors reflecting the bright overhead lights. Rows of students, most dressed in designer jackets and tapping away on expensive laptops, straightened as the door swung open. The elite professor strode in, wearing a tailored suit, silver-rimmed glasses glinting as he surveyed the room like a general before battle. Without a word, he set his leather briefcase on the desk and turned to the massive chalkboard at the front. Just then, the door creaked again. A woman stepped in, quietly, almost as if hoping not to be seen. Her clothes were plain, worn but clean. She clutched a small notebook to her chest, eyes scanning the room nervously. Conversations paused, heads turned. Some students exchanged amused glances. One snorted softly, and another smirked. She was clearly not one of them. The professor's eyes locked onto her. His brows arched, and he gestured toward her with the chalk. "You're lost," he said flatly. "Intro to literature is across the hall." She hesitated, but shook her head gently. "I'm here to observe," she said, her voice calm. "I want to learn." He chuckled, dry, dismissive. "Physics?" he said, as if tasting the word. "Then you won't mind a little test." He turned, scrawling a dense quantum mechanics problem across the board, symbols, integrals, and abstract functions winding like a maze. The room lit up with laughter. Someone whispered, "She's gonna faint." The woman said nothing. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing on the equation. The room grew quieter, watching her as if waiting for her to break. The professor folded his arms, amusement playing on his face. "Take your time," he said, smug. "Physics isn't for dreamers." She stood still. 5 seconds, 10, 20. No fear, no blinking, just watching the board. Then she stepped forward. The room stilled again. She reached for the chalk with steady fingers. No hesitation, just purpose. She raised her hand and, without a word, erased the first part of the equation, clean and exact. Gasps rippled through the class. The professor's smile faltered. She didn't look at him. Her eyes remained on the board, as if she were just getting started. A ripple of murmurs moved through the lecture hall like wind through dry leaves. Phones rose discreetly, cameras blinking to life. Some students leaned forward, their earlier laughter replaced with tight curiosity. The woman stood before the half-erased equation, chalk poised. Then, without a word, she began to write. Her hand moved with purpose, not hesitating even for a moment. She didn't just solve, she restructured. The equation unfolded under her touch like a story retold from a wiser voice. Symbols rearranged, variables introduced with deliberate care. The professor's smirk twisted into something more uncertain. He took a single step forward. "That's not how we approach it here," he cut in, tone still firm, but less amused. She paused, turned her head slightly, and replied in the same calm voice. "Your method ignores a fundamental constant, Planck's." Her finger tapped a specific point on the board. "Right there." The room fell utterly silent. Somewhere in the back, a student lowered their phone, eyes wide. The professor said nothing, his jaw stiff. She turned back to the board, unfazed, and continued. Her writing was clean, almost beautiful. Lines spaced evenly, notes marked in the margins with soft cursive that explained why each step mattered. She wasn't just solving, she was teaching. In the mind's eye, or perhaps in a silent montage, she appeared in a dim library, its shelves uneven and old. She flipped through worn textbooks, pages marked with pencil. Later, She sat at a small kitchen table, the light of a flickering candle casting shadows on a lined notebook as she worked through pages of equations, her brow furrowed in focus. Back in the lecture hall, her chalk struck the board one final time. The solution stood complete. Not just correct, but elegant, as if nature itself whispered it to her. She stepped back slowly, setting the chalk down with care. The professor didn't move. His eyes scanned the board, narrowed. He stepped closer now, arms behind his back, reading each line like scripture. A long moment passed, the entire class holding its collective breath. He didn't say a word. He simply stared, stone-faced, silent, while the woman stood beside him, not triumphant, just calm, as if this was never a surprise to her. The silence broke in a sudden, audible gasp. Then, a voice, barely above a whisper, said, "That's actually right." Another followed, louder this time. She just simplified a level 5 quantum field equation. The tension in the room snapped into stunned awe. Eyes darted between the board and the woman, then back to the professor, who hadn't moved. His hands were now clasped tightly behind his back, knuckles white. His pride, so carefully sculpted over years, had taken a visible crack. He turned sharply and picked up a marker, walking to the far end of the whiteboard. Without a word, he wrote again. This time something far more complex. A sprawling theoretical structure, an equation tangled in advanced tensor mathematics. It wasn't in any textbook. It was his. His unpublished thesis work, known only to a select few in his academic circle. He capped the marker slowly and turned to her. "Solve this." The room tensed again. The woman stared at it quietly. Then she looked at him. "Do I have a minute?" He nodded, arms crossed. She looked around and held up a hand. "May I use a marker?" Someone handed one over. She walked to a blank section of the whiteboard. Instead of attacking the equation directly, she began by drawing axes, X, Y, and Z. Then shapes, cones, curves, vector fields. She translated the dense, abstract equation into a 3D visual model. The student sat frozen, drawn in not just by what she was solving, but how she made it understandable. She broke the massive problem into small, elegant pieces, each step unfolding like a story, each shift of color on the board marking a transition in logic. Some students began to take notes, others simply stared in disbelief. The professor's expression darkened, not in anger, but in disbelief. He stepped closer, watching her every move. Her confidence never wavered. She finished the last symbol with a small arrow, drawing attention to the final form. A simplified, visualized proof. Stunning. Complete. In a flicker of memory, she sat at a break-room table in an old factory, her hands dirty from machinery, a plastic lunchbox beside her. She scribbled equations on a crumpled sheet of paper with a half-used pen, lost in a world no one around her understood. Back in the lecture hall, the professor finally spoke. His voice quieter now, almost human. "Where did you study?" She turned to him, that same calm grace in her eyes, and answered softly, "Nowhere official." The room hadn't settled before the door creaked open again. A faculty member stepped inside, then another. Word had traveled fast. Something unusual was happening in Lecture Hall C. Professors who rarely left their offices now gathered at the back, whispering to one another as they observed the whiteboard filled with equations, diagrams, and a clarity of thought none of them had expected. The woman stood calmly beside her work, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her presence was quiet but undeniable. One of the students, still reeling from what they'd just seen, asked the question lingering on everyone's mind. "How do you know all this?" She looked at him, then at the faces around her. There was no pride in her answer, just truth. I never went to school for it. I studied on my own. Open courseware, journals, lectures posted online, anything I could find. Her voice carried, not loud, but clear. I couldn't afford college, but I could afford a library card. The elite professor, who had stood rigid for most of the class, finally let his arms drop. His gaze softened as he stepped back, his silence heavy with realization. He had judged her based on her appearance, her quiet entry, her lack of polish, but everything he thought he knew had just been rewritten by the very woman he dismissed. A hand shot up near the front. A student, eyes wide and curious, asked, "Could you teach that last part again? I didn't catch how you flipped the field mapping." She nodded, walking to the board with a soft smile. The way she explained was unlike anything the room was used to. No jargon, no arrogance, just clarity, passion, and a love for understanding. Every sentence drew them in deeper. Even the professors at the back were nodding. The elite professor stood quietly, eyes fixed on her as she moved through the steps. There was no denying her brilliance. He didn't look defeated, just different. Finally, as she finished and turned away from the board, he took a slow breath and said, "You're the one who should be up here." His voice held none of the old superiority, only sincerity. She looked at him kindly, then toward the students. "Knowledge isn't about who stands in front," she said, "but who's willing to learn." And with that, she gathered her notebook and walked toward the door. The students rose to their feet, applauding, not out of habit, but out of awe. She walked out, the same simple woman, but now unmistakably brilliant. And somewhere, a voice echoed, "Never underestimate someone based on how they appear. Intelligence doesn't wear labels. It reveals itself when challenged."